Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call this episode the Top 20 UFO Cases in Arizona. I've gone through literally thousands of cases in the state of Arizona and picked what I think are the top 20 best UFO cases. And by that I mean the cases that are most well known in some cases, very influential, cases that have something unique to offer in terms of our understanding of UFOs, cases that have really shaped our understanding of this phenomena. I think another researcher may have come up with a different list, but this is mine and I'm super excited about presenting it to you today. So this is going to be a countdown of the top 20 cases from 20 all the way to number 1. Because there's so much information to present to you, I'm actually going to break this down into a 2-part episode. Part 1 will be case number 20 all the way to case number 11, and part 2 will be the top 10 cases. So let's just get started. And for case number 20, I chose Astronomer Seymour L. Hess sees a UFO. Despite allegations of skeptics, there are actually many accounts on record in which professional astronomers have observed UFOs. And that's true in this case with astronomer Seymour L. Hess of Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. At 12:20 p.m. on May 20, 1950, Seymour Hess was at Lowell Observatory when he observed a disc-shaped craft moving slowly against the prevailing wind at an estimated altitude of about 12,000 feet. So it was quite high up there. But he observed this object through binoculars and became absolutely convinced that it was a powered vehicle of some kind. As he says, and I quote, "It was extremely prominent and showed some size to the naked eye. That is, it was not merely a pinpoint." He heard no noise from this object as it moved across the sky and disappeared into a large cloud bank, but he estimates that it was no larger than 5 feet across and moving at about 200 miles per hour. Researcher James McDonald, an atmospheric physicist from the University of Arizona, was really impressed by this report because Seymour Hess was an astronomer, a trained observer, and knew about objects in the sky, and was still convinced that it was highly unusual. And in fact, James McDonald recommended that the Robertson panel, who was studying UFOs for the University of Colorado, recommended that they pay more attention to this report. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and the Condon Committee came up with a negative conclusion as to the veracity of UFOs. But this is a really interesting case, one of many in which professional astronomers have seen UFOs. So I think it definitely deserved a place on this list. That's case 20, a really remarkable and influential case that deserves to be more well known than it is. And that's why I gave it slot number 20 on this list. And now we move along to case number 19. And for case number 19, I chose mass sighting over Tucson. This is not a very well-known case, but it certainly deserves to be more well-known because it's really quite remarkable. Early on the morning of April 1st, 1958, literally hundreds of people in the Tucson area observed a group of 5 or 6 silvery objects floating leisurely eastward over the city. Calls flooded into the local news stations, and eventually these reports found their way to researcher James McDonald, who began a formal investigation. James McDonald was able to locate and interview no less than 80 separate witnesses who observed these objects from locations more than 70 miles apart. And after collecting and analyzing all the data, he was able to triangulate the reports. He contacted the local Air Force bases and local weather stations and ruled out any type of natural atmospheric phenomena, weather balloons, and conventional aircraft. He tried to get radar information from the Air Force, but was told that, quote, radar information is classified. But after all his research, a full picture of this incident emerged, and his investigation showed that around 6 a.m. on that morning of April 1st, 1958, a group of 5 or 6 oval-shaped, silver-colored objects, an estimated 25 miles high, moved overhead. And all the witnesses described essentially the same thing. And here's another very interesting thing about this report. After the objects left, a group of 6 Air Force jets appeared moving in the direction of the UFOs, so apparently chasing after them. James McDonald interviewed multiple groups of people who observed these objects together, including a group of weathermen, trained observers, several residents, a Navy seaman, a military pilot, a group of Greyhound bus passengers, and more. And he made numerous inquiries trying to find the identity of these jets, but received the runaround from the Air Force. And it was this treatment which first convinced James McDonald that our military, the U.S. military, was withholding information about UFOs. He eventually prepared a 40-page report on this sighting, which unfortunately was never published. His investigation, however, opened doors, and he soon became inundated by new witnesses who had heard about his interest in this subject. It's a really amazing encounter. So that's case 19. And now we move to case 18. And for case 18, I chose ranch UFO encounter. This case is virtually unknown, but it's got some really interesting and unusual elements, and I think it deserves to be more well known, and that's why I gave it slot number 18 on this list. On July 21st, 1985, ranch hand Scott Wilkins, that's a pseudonym, was working at the K4 Cattle Ranch in Yavapai County. This is located some miles northwest of Prescott, Arizona. And it was 9 p.m. in the evening, and Scott was working in the maintenance barn when he was called outside by 3 other ranch hands who stood with their families looking upward at the sky. Scott looked upward and saw this strange object moving at, quote, a snail's pace towards the main house on the east edge of the ranch. And this object, says Scott, was, quote, over 100 yards long, triangle-shaped, with 3 huge bright blue lights on the bottom and smaller porthole-like lights all the way around the object. Now, according to Scott Wilkins, this craft moved until it was directly over the main house, at which point it came to a complete standstill. And at this point, all the animals on the ranch became totally silent, and Scott saw that the horses were bunching up together against the fence as far from the object as they could get, and the dogs, who were normally very loud, were retreating to the barn and hiding behind the hay bales. So he runs to his house, and he got his wife and daughter, and they went outside and observed this object. And at the same time, he and the other ranch hands grabbed their rifles and pistols just to hope, try and protect themselves from what this thing might be. And a few of them actually brought cameras and began to take photographs. And here's where it gets very strange. The next thing everyone on the ranch knew, they were all back inside their homes, waking up the next morning. The owner of the ranch paid out yesterday's wages as he normally did, and they began the next day as usual. And Scott Wilkins and the other employees at the ranch began the long drive out to town to cash their checks at the local market. This is quite an isolated ranch. And when he and the others arrived at the store, they got an incredible shock. As Scott Wilkins says, and I quote, "It was 3 days later. The store employees had expected us 2 days prior. They showed us that day's newspaper. We just stared at each other in disbelief. But we weren't alone. Walnut Creek Station has 4 ranch headquarters and 1 Forest Service firefighters facility there. The store employee and night manager told us we were part of a stream of people who worked in Walnut Creek that showed up on the wrong day to buy our monthly stock of food." And the local feed store reported the same strange event as dusty old cowboys and their families came to buy tack, clothes, boots, shirts, barbed wire, etc. So apparently there was 3 days of missing time with multiple people. And according to Scott, this strange event caused major shockwaves throughout the entire community. Several of the wives moved off the ranch and back into town. Others nailed their windows shut and placed deadlocks on their doors. Some bought new guns and new guard dogs, and some left the ranch and refused to ever go there again. Several of the ranch hands reportedly found strange marks on the backs of their children, next to their belly buttons as well. Other ranch hands and their wives found marks on or near their knees. And around the same time of this incident, the ranch experienced several strange cattle mutilations. And according to Scott, these involved mainly pregnant cows, the calf laying there still in the birthing sac, but the mom cut to pieces. Their rear end just gone, eyes, tongue, guts just gone, and hardly any blood. And there were other strange effects, as Scott says. What was really strange, we all seemed to just forget about it, never discussing it. And in fact, according to Scott, it wasn't until the Phoenix Lights incident more than 10 years later that he even thought about the event at all. And according to Scott, he says that the object returned a number of times, usually around late July 21st. He later had the opportunity to examine some of the photos taken of the UFO over the main ranch house, and the photos from the digital cameras did not come out. The only camera that worked was an old Instamatic, and this photo showed only a big blur shaped like a triangle. So this is a very strange case involving what appears to be 3 days of missing time, animal effects, photographs, multiple witnesses. It's really a remarkable case and deserves to be much more well-known than it is, and that's why I gave it this slot. And now we move to case number 17. For case number 17, I chose the Cave Creek UFO crash. Arizona has actually quite a few reports of UFO crashes, and this is one of the more prominent ones, certainly not the only one, as we shall see. But this is one that is not super well known, and I think definitely deserves a place on this list, and that's why I wanted to present it to you today. Early one morning on October 1947, a gentleman by the name of Selman Graves, who was then 22 years old, and his brother-in-law, Bob Melody, who was 16 years old, decided to go rabbit hunting and explore some of the many abandoned mines in the area of Cave Creek. They drove over to their friend Walt Salyer's ranch house because he was supposed to join them. Strangely, however, Walt was nowhere to be found. So Selman Graves and Bob Melody retreated to the basement of the ranch house to wait for Walt Salyer, and he arrived 20 minutes later and seemed strangely agitated and upset. And whenever Walt or Bob got anywhere near the large freezer in his basement, Walt Salyer seemed to become, quote, especially nervous, And finally, he told his friends that they couldn't go hunting on the west part of his ranch because the Air Force was there and had restricted the area. He said that the Air Force might be spooked by any gunfire. And when he didn't elaborate, Selman Graves and Bob Melody set off alone on horseback, believing that Walt would join them later. So while they did that, they climbed to the top of a large hill, which gave a perfect view of the surrounding area. And to the west of Walt Salyer's ranch house, they saw something incredible. And I'll just let Selman Graves describe what they saw, as he says, and I quote, "What we saw can best be described as a large aluminum dome-shaped thing sitting upright in the desert." According to Selman Graves, this object was about 36 feet in diameter and about 1 mile away. So he and his friend wondered if this object might be some kind of observatory dome. But what was strange was that there were 2 military vehicles parked next to the object, and 5 men were milling around next to it. None of these guys appeared to be dressed in military uniform. So Selman Graves wasn't sure what to think of this incident, and after going hunting, they returned to Walt Salyer's home, and at this point, Selman's memory becomes confused. As he says, "There were men running around in the basement asking us questions about what we saw. I'm not sure what I told them, but I do remember telling myself not to forget, not to forget." He now thinks that he was brainwashed and actually made to forget. So here's a little audio clip from Selman Graves describing what happened.
The object, there were men and there were vehicles. The object was large compared to the size of the house, as far as saying how big it was at across and so forth, which I learned later, and it was approximately 36 feet. We had no idea what we were looking at, and we kicked things around. In fact, the first thing that we said was, the Air Force sure didn't fly this thing here. What are they doing? Why wouldn't they do it somewhere else? Maybe it's something, even we thought, maybe this is something to do with solar energy collection, some sort of a farming, but in any case, there was nothing that made sense of its being there instead of being on one of the bases. We had arrived there at about 10:30 in the morning, and when we left, it was about 10:30 at night. After we had finished looking at the shafts and seeing everything that could be seen, and it was getting late in the afternoon, we returned to Salyer's house. We didn't leave there until about 10:30 at night because there were some other men that came on the scene that detained us with various questions and so forth.
2 years following this incident, something else strange happened. Selman Graves saw a man with a bulldozer right at the same exact area where he saw this object. And as Selman says, "I couldn't figure out what he was doing. First off, he was rather well groomed for that kind of work, and he seemed to be digging ditches helter-skelter." So intrigued by this, Selman Graves approached the man on his break and asked him why he was digging random ditches in the area. And as Selman says, and I quote, "He laughed and admitted that he had been ordered to just mess up the ground." So many years later, in 1962, Selman Graves drove out to Salyer's ranch on a whim, he says, to ask what Walt Salyer remembered about the 1947 incident. And Walt was not happy about this. As Selman Graves says, he immediately got angry. He said, "Nothing like that happened. And furthermore, you have never been here at my ranch before." So this was really confusing to Selman Graves because he knew what he saw. And this is when he started to connect this all to UFOs. So sometime later, the television program Unsolved Mysteries heard about the case and decided to do an investigation. Unfortunately, by this point, Walt Salyer had died some years earlier. However, they were able to obtain some confirmation of the event. Reporter Don Devereaux of the Scottsdale Progress newspaper found a resident who had spoken with Salyer about the UFO event. And as Don Devereaux says, and I quote, he was supposedly talking about the incident, including the bodies in the freezer. The people in the bar thought it was funny and were razzing him about it. Strangely, Bob Melody, Selman Graves' friend, has no memory of this incident at all, but he does believe that his friend is telling the truth. And as Bob Melody says, I don't doubt it. Now, Selman Graves remains convinced that both he and his brother-in-law were victims of some sort of, quote, mind-bending hypnosis, end quote, by military officials to make them forget what they had seen. Researcher Sean Castile, who published an article about this case in UFO Universe magazine, writes, so there you have it. Arizona produces one mystery after another, some rooted in the ever-changing present, while others seep up from the dark well of the almost forgotten. If there are answers, they continue to elude us, at least for now. So there you go. Amazing case of an apparent UFO crash retrieval, including bodies, and a government cover-up. It's really quite interesting. So that's case number 17. Now we move to 16. And for slot number 16, I chose the William Rhodes UFO photographs. This is quite a controversial case, but it's a very interesting story and one of the first really interesting UFO photographs out there. I think it should be much more well known than it is, and that's why I gave it slot number 16 on this list. On July 7, 1947, around the exact same time as the Roswell UFO crash in New Mexico, amateur photographer William Rhodes of Phoenix was drawn outside by a strange sound. Hoping to photograph a jet, he was surprised to see instead what appeared to be a flying disc. He said it was semicircular, flat, and circling the area about 2,000 feet away. So William Rhodes quickly snapped 2 photographs of this object, which then veered and flew quickly off to the west. And realizing he had just captured 2 photographs of a flying saucer that the newspapers were talking about, he rushed to his laboratory and developed the film, and the 2 pictures came out perfectly. He offered them to the newspaper, the Arizona Republic, who published them on July 9th, 1947, under the headline, Saucer Flits in the Sky at Unbelievable Speeds. So the story develops from there. Kenneth Arnold, who's most famous for the sighting over Mount Rainier, viewed the photographs and seeing that they portrayed pretty much exactly what he had seen earlier that year over Mount Rainier, he publicly declared his belief that Rhodes's pictures were genuine. And it was Kenneth Arnold's endorsement that caught the attention of the Air Force and actually the FBI. And according to William Rhodes, the FBI showed up within 48 hours of the photograph being published. And these 2 men presented themselves as Lieutenant Colonel Beam from Hamilton Field, California, and FBI agent Mr. Ledding. And they interrogated William Rhodes about the sighting and the photographs. And as William Rhodes says, and I quote, they confiscated the negative and said I could get it back soon, but that never happened. And according to William Rhodes, in 1948, he was asked to travel to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio for an interview, but he declined. And it was shortly later that military and government officials arrived at his home to interview him again. As William Rhodes says, years later, when I called the FBI, they denied all knowledge of the incident. But then the bombshell occurred on March 5th, 1985, when the Air Force declassified Air Intelligence Report number 100-203-79. This formerly top secret report, originally dated December 10th, 1948, presents an analysis of the then current UFO situation at that time, reporting on different types of UFOs and speculating on their possible origins and intentions. And this report concludes that, quote, some sort of flying object, end quote, has been observed. So what are these flying objects? The report takes a very hesitant, conservative stance and says, it is not known at this time whether these observations are misidentifications of domestically launched devices, natural phenomena, or foreign unconventional aircraft. But important here is the appendix, Appendix C, which is called the Selected Reports of Flying Object Incidents. And several cases are mentioned, including the sighting by William Rhodes, which the Air Force conveniently said that they forgot. And this report clearly says that William Rhodes, and I quote, allegedly saw a disk circling his locality during sunset and took 2 photographs. The resulting pictures show a disc-like object with a round front and a square tail. These photographs have been examined by experts who state they are true photographic images and do not appear to be imperfections in the emulsion or imperfections in the lens. Today, some UFO researchers speculate that William Rhodes may have photographed one of the actual UFOs that crashed at Roswell, or one that's identical to them. This case is not without controversy. Some believe that Rhodes hoaxed these photographs, though no explanation is given to how he did this. But the fact that the FBI and government officials showed so much interest in these photographs, I think lends credibility to this case. And the fact that they denied it, and we now know that that was a lie, also I think shows that they were taking this very seriously indeed. Whatever the case, I think it's an important and influential case and could very well be an early, genuine photograph of the UFOs that were flying around during this massive wave during the time of the Roswell UFO crash. All right, moving along, and now we get to case number 15. For case number 15, I chose Luke Air Force Base UFO cover-up. This is another incident that's virtually unknown, but it involves an insider at Luke Air Force Base who admits to covering up UFO information. It's a very important case, and that's why I wanted to include it on this list. Now, it is well known that Air Force bases are primary targets for UFOs, and that certainly seems to be true in this case, where Luke Air Force Base had an incredible sighting. And here's a direct quote from an individual who worked at Luke Air Force Base at the time of this incident. This actually occurred on August 10th, 1974. And as this witness says, and I quote, as a former staff sergeant in the USAF and a tower crew chief at Luke Air Force Base Control Tower, a former Phoenix firefighter and engineer, a business owner, a jet aircraft mechanic for Lockheed Martin and NASA, a husband, father, and an American patriot, I promise you these comments are true and honest. So this is how this witness is introducing himself. And this gentleman worked as the tower chief when a colonel from Luke Air Force Base Command Post telephoned him on the hotline saying that he had a civilian resident from nearby Sun City who who was looking at a UFO at that very moment. And this colonel told the tower chief, who's anonymous, to take the call. So the chief answered the phone and spoke with the resident, a woman, who said that there was a bright object hovering over the White Tank Mountains. And she asked him repeatedly, "Do you see it? Do you see this object?" And as the chief says at Luke Air Force Base, and I quote, "The UFO was real and clearly visible. It glowed orange to red and seemed to move all about an approximate 2 to 10 degrees each time it moved." The lady repeated several times, "Do you see it?" And this chief from Luke Air Force Base lied and said no. He lied to her. And as he says, and I quote, "I wish to point out at this time that we lied to the lady. We saw the object all too well, but due to the extremely heavy amount of paperwork we would have had to undergo, not to mention a psychological assessment, we answered her no, and that was a lie. To this day, I regret lying to this lady." So according to this witness, this chief, he and 4 other officers in the control tower observed this glowing object for 45 more minutes when, as he says, suddenly and in the blink of an eye, it shot up and off to the right. At that point, it disappeared off into the distance. What's important here is that this chief at Luke Air Force Base and other witnesses saw this object, knew it was a UFO, and still lied about it and covered it up. And this just goes to show how badly our military has bungled this whole UFO situation. And he didn't tell the truth because he knew that it would cause not only paperwork, but it would actually put his own job in jeopardy. It's such a shame. And one can only wonder how many other incidents there are that occurred that we don't know about. And I have to give credit to this chief from Luke Air Force Base for coming forward, even though it was years later. It's an amazing case. So that's case number 15, and I think you'll agree that that's an amazing encounter. And now we move to number 14. And for number 14, I chose a radar visual UFO encounter. This is an amazing encounter involving multiple witnesses and a UFO that appeared on radar. This case comes from J. Allen Hynek, and I think you'll find it quite interesting. So this case occurred on January 13, 1967. And as I mentioned, it's a particularly well-verified sighting involving multiple eyewitnesses and radar confirmation. It was at 10 p.m. on the evening of January 13, and at that time, 2 pilots in separate planes, one was a National Airlines jet, and the other was a Lear jet. Each crew observed a mysterious red flashing object which appeared to be elongating and increasing in size. In addition to these 2 witnesses, an aircraft controller in nearby Albuquerque was watching the object on his radar screens and was also in communication with both pilots. And the radar operator noticed a very interesting and curious fact. Whenever the pilots reported the light flashing off, the object would disappear from his radar scope. And when the pilots saw the light flash on, the object would reappear on his screens. So this object was in view for more than 25 minutes. This did reach Project Blue Book and was investigated by J. Allen Hynek, who investigated this incident in depth. And as J. Allen Hynek writes, and I quote, "As the tower warned the jet that the object was getting closer, it seemed to play a cat and mouse game with the jet, involving some rapid accelerations. And according to Hynek, during this incident, the following conversation ensued between the controller in Albuquerque and the National Jet Airlines. The control tower said, "Do you want to report a UFO?" And the pilot of the National Airlines jet replied, "No." Then Albuquerque Control asked the pilot of the Learjet, "Do you want to report a UFO?" And the pilot of the Learjet replied, "No, we don't want to report." At this point, the object took off at a 30-degree angle upward and accelerated at super high speeds and was out of view in less than 10 seconds. So J. Allen Hynek pointed out this case in particular as an example of how attitudes toward UFOs can affect the reactions of the witness. So once again, it is the Air Force's policy of ignoring and ridiculing witnesses that led them to not want to report it. It's quite a shame. It's an important case that deserves to be really well known. So that's case 14, definitely a substantial case. Now we move to case number 13. For 13, I chose a disabled UFO. There are not many cases of apparently disabled UFOs. This is one of them, and it comes from Jim and Coral Lorenzen. It's quite a fascinating case, and that's why I gave it number 13 on this list. On June 26, 1962, UFO researchers Jim and Coral Lorenzen received a UFO report coming from their hometown of Tucson. The witnesses were two brothers, John and James Westmoreland, who were camping out in the backyard of their home with their friend Ronnie Black. John was 14 years old, and James and Ronnie were both 11 years old. Around 9 p.m. on that evening, they noticed what appeared to be an unusually bright star. It seemed to move slowly, becoming lower and lower in the sky, and when it became stationary, they lost interest. And this object remained in place for at least 2 hours, and it was around 11:45 p.m. it began to descend again, moving so close, so low, that the witnesses were able to discern a triangular shape. And at this point, it suddenly emitted 3 smaller green objects which darted away. And at the same time, another object swooped down and hovered in place above the first. So naturally, the boys were amazed and watched the first object emit another 3 green objects, which went into the second object. And the second object moved close enough that the witnesses could see what appeared to be some type of landing gear. And the second object retrieved one more of the smaller green objects from the first, and then it slowly faded away. And now a third object appeared, this time close enough to see a white, cone-shaped superstructure above a round aerofoil. The boys watched as a small door opened from underneath and 3 objects were emitted. It moved lower, and a cable was lowered for about 5 minutes and then drawn back up into the craft carrying a large, dark object. The door closed, and the object moved upward and to the east until it was out of sight. So Jim and Coral Lorenzen were very much impressed by this report. They questioned the boys extensively and concluded that the third and closest object was about an estimated 80 feet in diameter and a quarter mile from the witnesses. They also concluded that the object seen being pulled back up into the object was the same size as the smaller ships that they had seen. So the Lorenzens seriously considered the possibility that this was a disabled UFO being retrieved by a mother ship. And as they write, and I quote, "In view of presence of the smaller objects, we can theorize at some time or another one had become disabled and lost, a search was initiated, and a recovery eventually effected. The latter phase of the observations, in which a device was lowered to the ground and retracted to the third saucer at the end of it, could have been that recovery. This idea may be further supported by the saucer's prompt departure after the object was taken aboard. Recovery of the object from the wash may have been the sole purpose of the presence of the saucers that night. So whether or not this was an actual recovery operation of a disabled UFO is still a matter of speculation, but this is what Jim and Coral Lorenzen of APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, considered. It's a very interesting case, to say the least, and I think it definitely deserves a place on this list. So yeah, as you can see, that it's quite an amazing case number 13. And moving along, we now move to case number 12. And for case number 12, I chose Blue Book case number 2388, unidentified. This involves a weatherman, a very credible witness who had quite an incredible encounter involving two UFOs which he viewed through a theodolite. I think you'll find this quite interesting. So this next case took place at Yuma, Arizona, at 1:50 p.m. on February 4th, 1953. Now, as we have seen, most Blue Book cases that were labeled unidentified involve witnesses of high credibility, and that's certainly true in this case. The main witness is weather observer Stanley Brown, and he was using a theodolite, which is a camera attached to a telescope, and he was tracking a balloon. A theodolite allows the observer to sort of triangulate an object and measure its size and distance and movement. And as Stanley Brown is observing this balloon through a theodolite, to his amazement, he saw two UFOs approach right close to this balloon, perhaps to investigate it. And as Stanley Brown wrote in a written statement to the Air Force, and I quote, "I saw one object going upward and curving to the left. Although it moved rapidly, I was able to see it clearly and follow the flight. About 30 seconds after sighting the first object, a second object came into the field and swooped upward and across the path of the first object. The first object flew toward the west, while the second object swooped across or near the path of the first object 3 or 4 times, going out of the field about 2 times for a moment. The two objects passed near the lower portion of the sun and were traveling westward, the second object below and behind the first object, when a cirrus cloud came into the theodolite field, and I lost sight of the two objects. The objects were both the same size, almost round, a solid, dull, pure white color with a thin mist completely edging around each object. I am absolutely certain of what I have seen." So Stanley Brown says he observed these objects for about 5 minutes until they were lost in the clouds. And after being investigated by Project Blue Book, they were unable to come up with any explanation for what this object might be, and it's one of very few cases that made their unidentified list in Arizona. And again, this is case number 2388. It's quite an amazing case. And now we move to case number 11, the last one for this part 1 episode. And for case number 11, I chose Congresswoman Isabel Greenway King sees a UFO. There are not a lot of cases of government officials seeing UFOs, but this is one of them. It's virtually unknown. I think it should be much more well known than it is, and that's why I gave it the number 11 slot on this list. I think you'll find it quite interesting. On September 6, 1952, in Tucson, Congresswoman Isabella Greenway King, who was, by the way, Arizona's first female congresswoman, she observed a UFO. It was at precisely 4:55 p.m., and she was no longer a congresswoman at this point, but she and her friend, Bill McLean, observed an orange tear-shaped object overhead. According to the witnesses, it first whirled on its vertical axis, then descended very quickly, stopped, and began whirling in the opposite direction and retraced its path upward. It was a pretty brief sighting, but definitely unexplained, and Blue Book officers were called in to investigate. And after interviewing the witnesses and investigating the incident in detail, Blue Book officers were totally stumped. They could not identify it, and it became another one of the cases in Arizona that they labeled unidentified. And that's Blue Book case number 2048. So there you go. That's case number 20 all the way to case number 11. I did cover all of these cases in my book, UFOs over Arizona. And next week I will be covering case number 10 all the way to number 1. And I think you'll find that even more interesting. I certainly hope so. But that's it for now. I hope you found that interesting. And I want to thank you very much for watching. I truly appreciate it. Until next time, keep searching for the truth, keep asking questions, and keep having fun.